Welcome to episode 34 of the Liz McMullen Show. I have the trailblazer, the wonderful, the feminist, lesbian, Lee Lynch on my show. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks for inviting me.
So part of what I want this interview to be is I have a lot of curiosity about you and your life and your point of view. And I was wondering, how old were you when you realized that you liked girls?
15.
And
well,
did you have...
That's the official coming out age. I mean, there were certainly signs back to when I was 4.
Yeah.
But I didn't have the language then.
Yeah. So for you, when you discovered this, was it something, stressful to you? Is it something that you were ashamed of or didn't know what to do with? What was it like at the time? What year were you 15?
I was 15 in 1960.
Okay.
And I had never even heard of homosexuality. And then my best friend met a lesbian, and we realized that what we were feeling for each other was attraction.
Mm-hmm.
And so we acted on that. And for about 2 weeks, I remember this specifically, for about 2 weeks, I kind of struggled with it, saying, oh my God, why me? All that stuff you do. And after the 2 weeks, it's been just going forward, positive.
Mm-hmm.
I feel so lucky and so blessed to be gay.
So as you were growing up, a little further down the line, how did you find out about the publication, The Ladder?
Well, Susie and I used to go down to the village a lot. We lived in Queens, and we take the subway in, and there was, at first, we couldn't get into the bars at all because we were too young, and we didn't know where to go, but there was a place on 6th Avenue called Pam Pam's, and there was also a Pam Pam's bar, but this is where the underage gay kids hung out. Mm-hmm. And you'd go in and you'd buy a cup of coffee or an ice cream soda or whatever, and you stay there as long as they let you. And then you milled around outside. Mm-hmm. Down the street from that was, I guess it was a newspaper stand or store, and they had The Ladder. They carried The Ladder because, of course, Greenwich Village, they knew they could sell it. Mm-hmm. So I don't remember actually buying a copy or even having the money to buy a copy, but somehow we had a copy. And that's when I discovered there were other women like me, grown women, writing. Mm-hmm. But I think we only had that one issue back then. And then later, I was able to subscribe to it. Mm-hmm. when I reached the age of consent, 21, mm-hmm. So I didn't get in trouble for sending magazines, these awful mm-hmm. Pornographic magazines is how they viewed them. The authorities viewed them when they were actually just short stories and poems and interviews and some nonfiction essays. So that was how I started reading The Ladder.
And became a contributor.
And then at that age, at 21, I started sending poetry to The Ladder. And in terms of the history of The Ladder, this was just about when Barbara Greer, mm-hmm. who later founded Naiad Press with Donna McBride, Sarah Aldrich, and Anita Marchand, had taken over The Ladder from Daughters of Bilitis, mm-hmm. Which was not a good scene, but I don't really know anything about that. When I came to it, Barbara was in charge and was accepting my poetry, and then began giving me research assignments.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually already doing that kind of thing. I have an essay called Cruising the Libraries that Carla J. first published, about literally cruising the libraries, but not for women, for books.
Mm-hmm. Well, I saw that you also still do research as a part of your daily life.
Well, yeah. Anytime you're writing a book, it's not, everything's not in my head. So, like I'm sitting here. Today's a writing day. I've got 2 writing days this week, and I'm trying to write this chapter, and I'm just constantly going back and forth from an online thesaurus back to the chapter, and into a dictionary, and back to the chapter, and to Google, and back to the chapter. Yeah, I don't know what I did before we had the internet.
I know, that was my next question, of course,
Yeah.
which is, there's a whole lot of things that are wrapped up in that conceptually. Like, I'm 36, and when I was in college, the internet was there, but like creating websites and, doing a lot of the things that we do now wasn't really possible. It wasn't as good of a resource as it is now. And I tutor kids, and now if something confuses me in an assignment a teacher has given them, I actually type in different terms into Google, and I'm like, okay, this is how we're going to figure this out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the simplest things. When I wrote my first book, you drew on your own experience and memory, and I think I hope I can make my fiction richer now, that I can put in details that simply weren't available to me then, without going to the library and spending more time researching than writing.
Mm-hmm.
I had to figure out what kind of top a teenage girl would wear in 1952.
Mm-hmm.
And I just typed that in, and came right up.
It's a beautiful thing, the little pop-up. Did you work with the latter, make it easier for you to find a publisher for your first book?
Yes, because the editor was Barbara Greer. Then, the latter folded, and there was a kind of dry period there until the literary magazines, Common Lives, Lesbian Lives, and Sinister Wisdom began publishing.
Mm-hmm.
And I had been writing stories all that time and just sending them to Barbara because I didn't have anyone else to show them to. Writers need audiences. And she, being aware that I had, she referred me to those magazines, and they started publishing me. And eventually Barbara said, well, when you write a novel, I'll publish your short stories, but I have to write the novel first. So it wasn't like I was not in a position of having to find a publisher.
Mm-hmm.
It's already involved because of my prior connection to the publisher. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and because basically the reason why I have a lot of these questions is I have suppositions, things that points of view that I had from when I was going through college and then afterwards, and when I got into reading lesbian fiction, I started to, let's say if I chose a particular author, let's say Catherine V. Forrest, what I would do is either with new books or used books, I'd go on Amazon and I'd buy the entire library of that particular author. And Catherine V. Forrest, like you, is a lesbian fiction trailblazer. And what was interesting to me when I was reading her work was I could see the history of the women's rights movement and the gay rights movement as the years and then decades clicked by. Mm-hmm. And I could see what the life for, you know, a lesbian detective, what it would be like, and what environments and outlets and places in the 60s, 70s, and 80s where they had places to go. And then one of the books that changed my life, I believe, in 1998 was when I read Stone Butch Blues. Mm-hmm. And I had no conceptualization as to exactly what happened, and I was utterly horrified. And I couldn't imagine what it would be like to be a lesbian in you know, in the 50s and the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Things were changing, of course, but there was also a lot of things that were not changing, as well as backlash against social change, or, you know, rights for women and, you know, rights for the LGBT community. But I was curious, as a writer, how did you see the shifting sands as time went by? Did you change? Do you feel that you changed as a writer, or your point of view changed according to how things were going politically?
Very good question. I was a part of the time. I think what I was doing pretty much mirrored what was going on in the lesbian feminist community, because that's what I knew. So that's what I wrote about. I lived in two lesbian collective, well, one lesbian feminist collective, which was straight gay women, and one all lesbian collective. And I was in New Haven at the time. The Black Panthers were active, and there were connections between some of the women in the collective and them. And the whole idea of the collectives was women living with women and depending on women. And at the same time, there was the Women's Liberation rock band in New Haven and another one in Chicago. So we were making our own music and beginning to have something more than the bars mm-hmm. to go to. And that's what I was writing about. Mm-hmm. But I was also trying to write about the old life, real lesbians versus political lesbians. Mm-hmm. And I'd go back to I read stories about older lesbians in senior housing falling in love, or out in the desert being isolated and finding each other. And I just, when I wrote The Swashbuckler, I remember I tried to convey this epiphany I had that not all lesbians lived in Greenwich Village. Mm-hmm. And I can't express enough how surprised I was by all the lesbians in all the places all over the world. I was in this little place in New York growing up, and then well, I was in the city, but you have your own neighborhood. And then in New Haven we had this kind of enclosed structure where lesbians who were also feminists related to one another. But then little by little, with my imagination and also by meeting other women, I tried to reflect our diversity mm-hmm. in my stories.
Yeah, when I was reading Stone Butch Blues, one of the things that struck me was not only what the bars meant to the community, but also the social connections and also challenges, like being being obviously and outwardly butch and trying to find work and trying to get union jobs and be able to support themselves. And a lot of times for butches and for trans folks, they have a hard time getting work even now. So they relied on their femmes, and in Stone Butch Blue, some of the femmes were sex workers. And like I remember, one of the couplings where the woman, I think she was a stripper, and she had told her partner, her Stone Butch partner, not to ever visit her in the club, like in order to survive psychically and be able to do what she needed to do to put food on the table. She needed to have that separate. And that one time when her butch lover showed up, it spelt the end of their relationship. And when like in the Raid, where you which you've written, shows cross section and all the different folks who go to the bar and the things that they're struggling with that are also related to the times. It's not. I went to a women's college. I went to Mount Holyoke College. It's a bubble, and like you were saying, there's also kind of like a bubble of being in a collective that's somewhat divorced from a lot of the everyday realities of folks who are struggling with so many different things. And so how was your work received as you started to move away from what you knew within those circles to what was going on with lesbians in different parts of the United States, the region, the world? Like how do you feel that your approach, how was it received by your fans?
They bought my books. That's one way to measure it. There were so few of us, and so few were published that there weren't a lot of choices of how to get books and what you read. And to this day, I have women who come up to me and say, Toothpick House, my first book, was the first lesbian book they ever read. Mm-hmm. And women who say, I came out after I read the Swashbuckler, that my books had given them what I was trying to do. I had given them an overview of who we were, and made it easier to step into a lesbian world. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the feedback I was getting, that they got permission from books and stories and our magazines to be who they were, and to go through the world knowing they weren't doing this alone. Mm-hmm. There was a lot of gratefulness. I think all of the early lesbian writers of this generation received a lot of gratitude. Mary Jane Meeker, who was also Vin Packer, and Ann Aldrich talks about the thousands of letters she got, because at the time it was just her. Mm-hmm. And then there was Valerie Taylor, and she, when she was alive, would tell me about the letters she'd get, just total gratitude. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It was kind of a life-saving mission. I started writing these books, not just because that was my experience and what I knew, but I knew how reading Jane Rule's Essays of the Heart and Isabel Miller's I forget the original title, but Patience and Sarah is what it became, and Radcliffe Hall's Well of Loneliness. They made me feel so much better about myself and made me accept myself, and made me proud. They were wonderful books, and these were lesbians writing them. Wow. So that's what I wanted to give readers.
Well, I think that you're still doing very well on that particular mission of showing, seeing, I guess what's important, especially when there was so little, is seeing ourselves in print and seeing our lives played out. So, something to hold on to. And Beggar of Love is one of the books that I read for this interview. And Jefferson, when she was younger, was hungry for seeing herself, seeing other lesbians either, in print, and, for the lack of it, she felt that she was floundering along, trying to find herself and mostly being lost. But that desire, I remember when I realized, not that I had to have like a little corner of the world, that there were entire books and even stores for us, like Different Light in Manhattan, which closed a long time ago, but was huge.
Yeah.
Huge. And most of the times when I went into Oscar Wilde Bookshop, I didn't have any money to buy books. I just went there to be there.
Yeah. It was a place you were safe for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
We had a bookstore in Bridgeport, Connecticut called, how can I forget that? Bloodroot. It was a restaurant and bookstore. And every Wednesday night, this was in the 70s and 80s, it was women only. So that was a big magnet for the community. And we had a woman named Rhea Hirschman in New Haven who sold books out of her car, lesbian books out of her car, and then out of her house, and then eventually she had a storefront. And as far as I know, that store is still going, but she sold it. But all over the country this was happening. And also in the early 70s, Judy Grahn and Pat Parker, poets, were like our troubadours. They just went around the country, and wherever they could read, they would read. Mm-hmm. So they tell us, we've just been in Baltimore, or we've just been wherever, and created a map of us for those of us that had no way of knowing where the women were, and that yes, you could survive in the Midwest, and then publications like Lesbian Connections came out, and that's not literature, but I think that's the kind of thing that our literature birthed. The realization that there was a great population of us, and that we needed a way to connect. Mm-hmm. And then the music festivals started, and those were so intoxicating. Mm-hmm. I remember the first one I went to was Amherst, University of Massachusetts. It was a huge auditorium. It was full of dykes, screaming, yelling, laughing, and the Christian and Holly Near were just energized and electrified. Wow! That was one of the my most amazing experiences in that feminist period. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I in the late 90s, I was in college, and I used to go to the Ben and Jerry's Folk Festival. I went a couple times. Mm-hmm. And Ani DeFranco and the Indigo Girls were like huge draws. And I remember, I tried not to like those two bands because in college, go to a women's college as well, and the particular culture for, feminists and lesbians, like there are things that you're supposed to like. And so I decided not to like them for that very reason. And then my friend had an extra ticket to go see Ani DeFranco in Connecticut. And I was like, all right, I'll go. And I felt madly in love with this woman, her strength and vulnerability and intelligence, and instead of being a part of the grind, she created her own record label, Righteous Babe Records, which is just so cool. And it has that energy that I just remember, even going to women's college, going to this festival was so different. I had never seen so many different kinds of lesbians in my life.
Yeah.
It was a revelation.
Right. I saw Andy DeFranco in Connecticut, also in New Haven, and I'm trying to remember if that was the same concert. It probably was a different one. Suede came along, and of course she's just a really wonderful musician, and she teamed up with a group of gay men for a while, and so that was also going on during that time period. That there was separatism where we had to be by ourselves, and then little by little, the gay community again recognized that we were all together in this.
Mm-hmm. How did you feel about separatism?
Whatever there is to rebel against, I rebel. I lived in southern Oregon, where there are still several pieces of women's land where women live as much as possible separate from men. As a matter of fact, yesterday a friend and I were following, there was a fire, a forest fire really near one, and the lesbians in that community were just, saving their animals and going to each other, homes, other lesbian homes away from there. That was where I most experienced being friends with lesbian separatists. And there was actually a period of my life before that, when I was still in New Haven, that I just hated all men, just back. Didn't want anything to do with them, looked down on them. But when I got to Southern Oregon and saw how these women lived and got along or didn't get along, it turned me off. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't that I went out seeking men to be with, but there were gay men in the community too. As a matter of fact, I lived really close to where the Radical Fairies have one of their communes or Radical Fairyland. And
can you explain what that is? I know what it is, but some of our listeners may not know what that is.
What a Radical Fairy is?
Yeah.
They're gay men that are into spirituality and into living on the land, and probably other things too. There actually used to be a newsletter called RFT. I can't remember what it stood for, but you can imagine. And it was just like the women's land. They could walk around wearing or not wearing whatever they wanted. They had rituals and celebrations, and they just lived with other men. Harry Hayes, was that his name, was the leader of that movement. And there's some books out about it. I can't explain it. I was not a Radical Fairy, but what I know is they were very, very open and loving and a lot of fun.
It sounds good to me. My parents are of your generation, and they were hippies. My mom, not so mostly for the political parts of it. They joke that my father started the Age of Aquarius coffee shop at his college, and my mom would be playing pinochle in the back of the room. She's a mean pinochle player. You would never guess, because she looks like that, very quiet, innocent, sweet-looking woman. But she was a wicked good card player. My dad was like consciousness raising and organizing protests and all that kind of stuff. So I'm somewhat familiar with that. And then, of course, my father never told me that he wanted me to go to Mount Holyoke until after I decided to go myself. And I loved going there, but I remember taking women's studies classes sometimes was a very stressful experience, because, I always felt like there's somehow I'm going to say something wrong, unintentionally something that I will say will be, interpreted as entitled or a whole bunch of other different words, and I was so lost in the schema of PC language. And I loved the classes. Great. Jean Grossholtz was an amazing woman and a trailblazer for, she's a women's politics professor, and, went to women's conferences all over the world and UNIFEM and all that kind of stuff. And she's just an incredible individual and very unusual. And I appreciate her a lot. She never wore a bra. And she always had some kind of political graphic tee whenever she was in class. And it was never the same one. She must have had hundreds of them. And she just gave it to us straight. Like, I took sex and politics, which gave me nightmares the entire semester because it was dealing with all different kinds of awful sexual things, rape and whatnot. And I was just like, it was an important class, but it freaked me out. And politics of patriarchy, where, we read The Bluest Eye and were challenging and experiencing different authors who, from multitude of backgrounds, but it was still very stressful. I was like, I am into women's empowerment, but I always felt disempowered in those classes. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does make sense to me. Living in the collective, I also felt disempowered, out of place. I was an old gay. That's what we used to call it. We were old gays and new gays. And these were mostly political lesbians who came out as an expression of their feminism. And I know at least some of them went back to men afterwards, but they tended to be the ones that set the rules, that taught the classes, that started the self-help clinics, so where women would actually be our own gynecologists to an extent. And
like our bodies ourselves?
Yeah, I like that. That book was the Bible. One year in one of the collectives, we hung plastic speculums wrapped in aluminum foil on the solstice tree. And I felt like there was a lot of judgmentalism. So, of course, I got into my rebellious state and it withdrew from that. They looked down on couples. They thought, there should be all open relationships, that marriage was no good, that commitment was a patriarchal idea.
But so was penetration, apparently.
I don't know anything about that.
No, what I mean is that there were some feminists, lesbian feminists, who thought that any sex that included penetration was patriarchal in nature. Like the use of toys or the use of strap-ons or even penetrative sex with fingers, that there was some, politics behind whether or not that was acceptable sexual behavior. And like the concept of, the personal as political. And it seemed that some feminists had politicized the womb almost as much, if not the same way, that men would for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. I agree. It just got too strictured. And I went back to the bars. Mm-hmm. We had a chain of small supermarkets in the area, and a lot of us were gay, and that became my community. Mm-hmm. And at first, I tried to bridge the two communities by bringing home to the collective bar dykes and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So there was, and they were fascinated by the bar dykes. And, I don't know. I got out of that. I mean, I'm a feminist, definitely a feminist. Mm-hmm. But there was an artificial world being built on principles that did not resonate with me. Mm-hmm. live like that anymore. And so going back to the bars meant, openly being in a couple, for one thing. And that, that's something I personally prefer. I'm not someone who wants to multitask sexually. I believe in monogamy.
So, did you see the film If These Walls Could Talk Too? It was on HBO. This was in the 90s.
No, I did not.
It was centered around a house, and it showed that home being owned in 3 different generations. One of them being, I think, either the late 60s or the early 70s. The first one was with Vanessa Redgrave and her partner, and they had made a life for each other, and even though the house was not in both of their names, they had paid it off together. And her wife was up on a ladder, and she had fallen, and when she went to the hospital, she wasn't allowed to be with her partner, and so she slept in a cramped plastic chair, and it turns out that her partner had passed in the night, alone. And because they couldn't be, she could have lied and said that she was the sister or something like that, or whatever. But because it was showing, like, what it's like not to have the same rights as married couples, including being able to be there for your partner, to hold her hand as she dies, rather than both of you being irrevocably separated. And then the story gets from heartbreaking to beyond a nightmare, where it turns out the only living relative is a nephew, and he plans to sell the house and has no intention of supporting somebody else's old maid sister or whatever, however he was interpreting on that. And so he showed up with his wife and child, and the woman's partner had collected birds, like little figurines, and the wife of the man said, "Oh, you can keep one if you like." And then she was put out of her home, and that was the end of that segment. And the next segment was in in college in the 60s, or 70s, and it broaches something of what I said about Stone Brush Blues, about how there's no place for, like, there was a feminist professor in that book, and she could not be accepted because she wore lipstick and was a femme. And the same thing went for that particular segment of These Walls Can Talk, where Chloe Sevigny was playing a butch who, had the Brill-creamed back hair and very formal and chivalrous and gentlemanly. And she had come over to the house where all the roommates lived, and they were trying to ruffle up her hair and tell her that she's a stiff, and to take off her button down, and don't you wish you could wear something more feminine, I guess. And so they were traumatizing this butch for being something that they were hostile towards.
Right.
So I can imagine, the Bardykes and femmes, even though they were the ones for decades, taking the risk, going to the bars, maybe holding their partner's hands, walking down the street, and yet when it came to the gay rights movement, they felt that there was no place for them there.
None of that was my experience.
Well,
I've never had a problem in a hospital with a partner. And when I say I went back to the bars, it wasn't because of, well, I don't know how to describe it. The bar, by the way, in The Raid, my latest book, post book, was based on those years post collective living, and it was a really warm community of women and men who cared about the bar and each other, and that's the heart of being gay for me. And people who do the kinds of things you're describing, rejecting the femmes with lipstick on and tormenting the butches who are just dressing and acting naturally, they're just not gay. I'm sorry. There's homophobia in acting there, internalized homophobia, whatever. We need to be a community. We need to respect one another and accept, not be judgmental. Accept, if somebody wants to wear their hair one way, I think when they're straight, or another way, that's accepted. And I just don't understand the.
It's like gender enforcing behavior.
Thank you. Yes, reject. I don't understand rejection of one another when we're all connected.
Mm-hmm. For one of the reasons why I did a series on gender and sexuality for my show, and something that's always been on my mind, is because of these different strictures. And I remember when I was in college, I wanted to have a girlfriend. I considered myself bisexual at the time, and women wouldn't date me for that reason. So that was kind of like the biphobia thing going on. And then there were some women who would consider me, but they felt that by having long hair and passing, that I wasn't committed to being a lesbian. And then others would tell me, oh, if I wanted to be with someone like you, I would be with a man. So somehow I wasn't woman enough to be a lesbian.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like it was pretty traumatic for you.
Yeah, and it's not, I'm sorry to interrupt. It's not all of the experience. It's just those little, how it's those little things that leave footprints in your memory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I hope we're past that. And when we go to the Golden Crown Literary Society, I don't see any of that happening.
That is a utopia if I ever saw one. I went there this year for the first time, yeah.
Yeah, and everybody's outrageously themselves, and it's fun.
It is. It was so much fun. And one of the reasons why I chose to live my life the way that I do is I love lesbian bars, and I love, the family that is created just from, a shared experience, of, and
it's that Golden Crown.
Yeah.
With alcohol.
Without the alcohol, yes. That's something else that I also have noticed changing over time, is that there are more and more groups that you can go to. Let's say if you're going to the Gay Center in New York City, there are more and more groups that you can go to that are beyond just either a lesbian support group or going to bars, but, people, I can't remember the culture vultures, like, people who wanted to go to museums and musicals and the ballet and the opera, and there are just a lot of other cultural options there, and it's flourishing, absolutely. And I loved going to the to the GCLS conference this year, because I was surrounded with people that not only were lesbians or however they identify, but they love lesbian fiction as much as I do. So it was a lot of fun.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that they give back to the community, the Golden Crown, they recognize those of us who came first and didn't have anything like that. They acknowledge us and give us awards and stuff, which is just so important to keep the culture going. Because then the younger or newer lesbian writers have goals, have something to be ambitious for besides just writing for the sake of writing. So the community grows, and we pass on our what we have learned in our books and our strengths. And they see that, Anne Bannon shows up, and I don't know if she's 80 yet, but she's hale and hearty and still talking about Bevo Brinker.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us something we never, ever had before, a history and a structure that we can stand on and expand on.
One of the other things that I liked when I went to the awards ceremony was learning about our foremothers, the women who went before us. Can you talk a little bit about the award that you were giving out in Dallas that night?
Well, last year I was suddenly floored that they had created something called the Lee Lynch Classic Award.
Mm-hmm.
And they awarded the first one to my book, The Swashbuckler. And I just, that was like the greatest honor. These were not lesbians who were making rules about how to be lesbians. These were lesbians being a family. And so this year, what they did was they have the trailblazers, all the past trailblazers, nominate a classic book. And this year it was Spring Fire
mm-hmm.
by Ben Packer. And so I was able to present the classic award to Ben Packer for that
mm-hmm.
book. And at the same time, Rachel Spangler, the young author, presented the Trailblazer to her. Now, Ben Packer, Mary Jane Meeker, is in her mid-80s and had stuff going on, and she couldn't make the trip. But they got a video of her accepting the award and talking about her experience as a lesbian writer in the 50s. And those are the kind of people we want to recognize and educate the younger generations of lesbians about the guts that she had back then.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not be political bickering. Let's all be Mary Jane Meekers and find our way in life as lesbians. That's who we are.
Yeah, I had not heard of her. I'd always had in the back of my mind, I'd seen covers and also the pulp fiction kind of authors that were out there. And I had never heard of her, and I remember sitting and listening, and I'm like, what a terrible thing it would have been if I had never heard her story or what she had gone through or the experience that she had when she was talking to her publisher and the strictures that he put upon her in order to agree to put out the book, including the fact that it could not have a happy ending.
Correct. And which became an inspiration to me and other writers who came along to make happy endings in books for lesbians.
Mm.
That was one of my initial impulses for writing. Because I read Ben Packer and Ragnar Hall, I wanted a literature that sustained us rather than discouraged us.
What were some of the things that you were trying to do when you started the syndicated series called The Amazon Trail?
Well, actually, my partner at the time suggested it would be a good way to make some money. Because I've never made much of anything as a writer. And she was wrong. But it got me started. And I did make some money initially. And still do a little bit. So it was her encouragement. And we call them columns, not blogs. Mm-hmm. And I first got picked up by Just Out of Portland. Renee LaChance was one of the publishers at that point. and it was well received. I just started writing about my life, little vignettes about things that had happened to me, things that I was doing as a writer, conference I was going to, what it was like in the bars, and that I got a lot of encouragement for that, and I started sending it to other papers, and so it's been since 1986. It's appeared in a variety of publications and venues across the country, and always changing because, of course, the journalism world always changes. But I've missed 1 month when I've had a knee replacement, so I've written a column every month since then, and being told that I'm somehow collecting our history, and
I can definitely see that.
It's validating. I get emails about how validating it is, or how grateful people are to learn what's going on.
So I called you earlier to see if you could read your most recent one. Mm-hmm. Could you do that for us?
You bet. This is called Old Folks Hill. And hopefully it'll be self-explanatory. It's that time of life. We're living on Old Folks Hill and loving it. We were just checking out the neighborhood when we came upon this house. It's gorgeous by our standards. It's sunny even in the rain, relatively low maintenance, close to town, in a safe place for walking, and almost large enough for our books. My sweetheart is a little young for this age-restricted community, so we had to fess up that she's my caretaker. Of course, I'm hers too, but not in the way the federal government housing rules require. Though recent rulings by the Supremes at least allow us to take care of each other legally. I used to come up here to garage sales. I'd park for a while and walk my late dog Ginger. The homes are all manufactured, tidy and trim, with a variety of designs and a plethora of landscaping styles, from clearly professional to downright tacky. There was imagination in the neighborhood and leisure to work in the gardens. The breezy air was clean, scented with a combination of the forest behind and the ocean below. My mother used to say that the Kangamungus Trail in the White Mountains of New Hampshire in autumn was her idea of what heaven looked like. Mine is here on the Pacific coast, right where I live. I'm fortunate beyond imagination. The building where I grew up in Queens had 96 apartments. At least 2/3 housed oldsters. I was taught to be respectful and helpful. They liked me. I wasn't a roughneck like some of the other kids. For my part, I was more comfortable with the older people than I was with most of the children in the building. Some old people were grouchy around youngsters, but some were kind, generous, and inclusive. One couple brought me exotic dolls from their travels. Another simply spoke to this serious, unsmiling little kid without being patronizing. Now I'm perched on this hill with people in the same age range as my early pals, but I'm one of them. The neighbors west of us, Alaskans, are even younger than me. We look over their pretty garden at the ocean from our living room. They've helped with our yard, which ceaselessly sprouts weeds through the plastic sheeting and lava rock our Texan sellers left. The neighbor to the east is a gruff wheeler-dealer who lives elsewhere and calls his house his albatross. It's hard to get along these days on a manufactured home, as we found out, and for sale signs abound. Many residents walk dogs. I always carry treats in my pocket. It's pretty easy to meet folks that way. Gretchen, Bijou, Rowdy, Mason, and Max. I remember the dogs' names, but their people, forget it, which is okay up here on Old Folks Hill, because my neighbors are even less likely to remember mine. We all joke about it in a comradely, self-deprecating way. We're growing old together, witnessing the pleasures and, well, less pleasant aspects of aging. At the 4th of July indoor picnic, we stood on the food line behind a caravan of walkers. A retired longshoreman and his guide dog shared our table. Another gentleman repeatedly tells us how his sweet miniature dachshund has been taking care of him since his wife died. One evening, we heard all sorts of sirens come up the hill. It turned out that the hermit, a couple of streets east, had been dead for 5 days. The responders went in wearing hazmat suits. There have been a number of estate sales since we moved in. The resident turnover here is kind of high. On the brighter side, today we met an 88-year-old woman whose grandfather, a pioneer politician, had a main thoroughfare in town named for him. A couple of weeks ago, we met a woman just turning 90, pretty deaf, and full of all sorts of stories. I often see a lively resident nicknamed Walker with her customary plastic rain bonnet and pull-along shopping basket, hiking around town and taking our hill at a good pace. She's in her 90s. Then there are the young people, a couple in their 60s who started a woo-woo spiritual group at the neighborhood clubhouse. A new resident involved in creating a nearby spiritual retreat. Another who was raised by hippies in an early commune. Wow, these are my peers. This is the 60s generation. They were the Rolling Stones fans and the Vietnam soldiers and the housewives turned feminists. So this is what we look like all grown up. This is who we've become. One group plays mahjong weekly, another does needlework. There's a computer club, a pool, and a pool table. We have our own landfill and recycling bins. Bumper stickers include coexist and the Army. Those of us who are able can walk to the beach. We seem to be the only gay people here so far, but Old Folks Hill is our heaven on earth. And as far as we can tell, our relatively recent gay wedding hasn't destroyed any of the venerable marriages around us. My first 3 years of columns were collected in a book called The Amazon Trail, which is still available from Bolstroke or Bella Books.
You know what, I didn't mention this before when I was preparing you for the interview, but I think that my listeners would like a chance at winning a copy of The Amazon Trail. Is that something that you'd be willing to do?
You bet. Yeah, I have a few left here. Yeah.
Super. So, listeners, if you're interested in getting a copy of The Amazon Trail, email me at thelizmcmullenshow@gmail.com, and I'll put you in a batch, and I will use a handy-dandy randomizer that I found online that will choose the winner.
Great idea.
Yay. Of course, it occurs to me after the fact. The reason why I asked you to read this article is because I think it is a perfect example of those everyday observations and common everyday experiences that are so important and valuable, and just to have a record of it, and that you've been doing this column for so long. If somebody sat down and looked through all of them, they could see history passing through the pages.
Yeah, I know. I never intended that, but it's a pretty good, from one person's perspective, one lesbian's perspective, reflection of these almost 30 years. And I hope to have more columns in book form.
Yeah, I really enjoy this kind of stuff because my pop is a little over 90, and I like sitting with him and just listening to him say whatever he's in the mood to say. Because he was a quiet guy when I was growing up, one of those, what I consider, the man's man. He had a picture of John Wayne on his, what's it called, fireplace. And he loves his dogs more than he loves people, which is which is so him. And it's yeah, he's simple. He's not really interested in talking and whatnot. And he just is, he worked hard when he was working, and even after he retired, continued to work hard until his body is just not agreeing with all the things that he'd like to do. But now he tells these stories of being a kid, and I was I want to capture all these gems. And
yes. Yeah.
And
I anytime I run into an older lesbian or an old lesbian, I do encourage them to at least make audio to talk into a tape recorder with the stories. It would be so valuable to us.
absolutely. And the spoken word and people telling their lives in their own words, and it's like a intellectual psychic marker, that they existed and that their thoughts and experiences and feelings are now part of the fabric of what we experience today.
Yeah, yeah. It's so important. Every one of our experience, the experience of every one of us, I think it's important for others to hear. And that's one reason the archives are very, very, they're just treasures.
The advent of cheap ability to record video, like anything from your phone, like not cheap as in, affordable for everybody, but not prohibitive as movies were when you had to buy film. Now you can, I was taking a class on documentaries, and he said now, you don't have to go around for years raising money to be able to afford to buy the film to record whatever projects you're working on. You can record hundreds of hours on, a little stick, a little, chip. And it, I encourage those listening to this episode to take a moment and sit down with, not just queer members of the community, but, people who are older and have experiences and ideas and thoughts to share, and put them down on audio or on video and help us hold on to the oral history, because so much is lost without those special individual stories.
And it's lost partially because we don't understand, as I didn't understand, that I was living history.
Mm-hmm.
And that my experience was something that could be captured and passed on and have meaning to somebody.
Exactly. I had been pondering this because I had interviewed, I'd read a textbook for an interview I did last week. And I was thinking to myself, oh, God, if I had the money, I'd go back. I'd be like a perpetual student. I'd be racking up PhDs. And then I realized that I valued formal education as the playground for which with to have deep thoughts and to talk about politics and whatnot. And it occurred to me that having this show and the goals that I have for it is also a piece of history, and it's focused on lesbian fiction. I've had 33 episodes so far, and this is its own record, so I don't need to spend tens, if not nearing $100,000 to be able to do something valuable and contribute.
This is very valuable, and I really appreciate that you do it.
It's a gem for me. It's amazing because first I was a guest host on the Cocktail Hour, and it floored me that my favorite authors would be willing to come on and lend an hour of their time and talk about their work. I was like, oh my God, these amazing famous people are letting me talk to them.
You teach us how to do Skype. I mean,
yes, a skill I learned from Andy from the Cocktail Hour. She taught me how to use Skype, and it used to make. I remember when I first Skyped with her, I was so nervous because I was like, she's the co-host of the Cocktail Hour, and I'm just an ordinary person talking to her.
Andy Marquette.
Not Andy Marquette. Andy from the Cocktail Hour. Andy Marquette, I've had on the show a few times. She is hilarious.
She's wonderful.
She's just a wonderful human being all around. And so I'm kind of excited that my show functions as a oral history project where I talk to people about their lives and their books, and this has been a very valuable episode, and I feel very blessed and pleased that you were able to give me some of your time.
Oh, well, It was all my pleasure. And again, what you're doing is important. I'm very glad to be part of it.
Thank you so much for coming on the show, Lee.
Thank you, Liz.